Welcome, church, to our second week in our series called Asking for a Friend. If I haven't met you, my name is Kenny, and we decided a while back to do a series where we wanted to talk through some of the really relevant issues that our church has been dealing with. So we sent out a survey and literally got hundreds of questions among several different topics of questions that maybe you want to know about, maybe you want to hear the answer to, but questions that maybe you would ask for a friend. And if you haven't heard this in our culture, you know, the asking for a friend questions are questions that maybe we're uncomfortable asking, but we really want to know the answer to. Like maybe you're a guy who's got a crush on some girl, right? And you send your friend to ask her if she's single, right? You ask, hey, are you single? I'm asking for a friend. Or maybe you're a parent who's been quarantined with your kids and you're asking, is corporal punishment still legal? Like, am I allowed to do that? I've been locked up with this kid for what seems like months, right? Or how many planets are there? And whatever happened to Pluto? Some of us really want to know the answer to this, but we don't want to ask anyone. I'm going through this with my 5-year-old in kindergarten who's learning about the solar system. And evidently the whole world has changed since I was in kindergarten. Or what about the 401ks? You're watching the stock market crash and people talking about their 401k. But what happened to what is a 401k? Asking for a friend. You don't really want to ask that sort of question. Or these are really the questions you might even Google. That's what we would call an asking for a friend question. Like, how many days can I go without showering and still be considered clean? And the answer is less than 1. All right, shower daily. That's important if you have water in your house. Or does sleeping make me less productive or more productive? And so we might Google questions. And so they'd be asking for a friend. So we kind of took the questions. As the survey went out, it went into topics. And there were several different topics. And so we're going to talk about some of these topics on Sundays. Last weekend, if you missed it, our lead pastor talked about the topic of anxiety. And so it was a really good, we followed up with some great Facebook Lives this week. Go back and check those out. But next weekend, we're going to talk about depression. And that is going to be really interesting. And I hope you'll check it out then. Today, we are going to talk about relationships. And there were a ton of questions about relationships. And so we kind of broke them down. And there was so many questions on some of the other topics. We didn't feel right about just ignoring them. So what we're going to do is on Wednesday nights at about 8 o'clock, we're going to go live and talk through the rest or some of the other topics over the next few weeks. So put that on your calendar, 8 o'clock, check it out. And we are going to go live talking about some of these other topics, that the sexuality and human sexuality and homosexuality, all these different things that people want to know about. How do we deal with money? What does God have to say about money? All these different questions and really, frankly, touchy subjects. We're going to do our best to get some biblical perspective on as we're processing all this. So let's look at the questions about relationships. We broke them up into a couple of categories today, and I want to dive right in. And so here's the first kind of category. It says, how do I know if I found the right person? Now, this might be asked by someone who is wondering, the verbiage they use might be, how do I know if I found the one? Or what do I do if I'm in this season of singleness? Or should I remarry? Or is it too late to remarry? Or how do I remarry, right? And so these are really good questions. And we even get to this in the context of, should I stay married to this person? Am I currently married to the one? And in our culture, in our world, we talk about our soulmate and how much our soulmate is important. And it creates this world of belief, like everything is a fairy tale, like it lives in Disney. And if you're married or you're in a dating relationship and you've had an argument, you've had a fight in your life, you've had something like that take place, then you must not be living with your soulmate, because something like that doesn't live in the fairy tale, right? And that's what our culture continues down. And some of the religious circles would even go into what I would consider just as negative of a circle, when a religious circle might tell you that God has one special person for you, and you've got to get that one special person. And that one special person, if you don't get it, you're missing God's mark for your life. You're his best. Like one person out of 3.5 billion on the planet. And no wonder we get anxiety about this. No wonder this is a top question, right? And I remember thinking this question just before I was married. Is this the right one? And finally, I came across something that was really helpful, and I want to offer this to you. If there was just one person for every person, you know what the problem with that is? That somewhere thousands of years ago, somebody already messed this up. Right? Like the genetic pool was messed up when George married Suzanne back 500 years before Christ, and they weren't supposed to get married. And now the whole genetic pool is messed up in Anglo-America. And so here we are. Nobody is able to potentially marry the right person, right? It's ridiculous. And so let me remove that pressure from you. But I do believe you should follow God every step of the way. And so as he leads you. So some people think about it in terms of compatibility. Like, I must be married to the right person if we're compatible. And there's a lot of people like to list off all the qualities that they want in someone. And the best question for them is this: are you the kind of person that attracts the kind of person that you want? I mean, the reality is, if we want a certain kind of person, are we really attracting them with how we're acting? And so this works if you're single, but this also works if you're married and maybe your marriage is struggling because you've been locked in a house with them for a month. And maybe you hear, well, I only attract the rude guys, or I only attract the promiscuous type, or I only attract the crazy ones, whatever it is. If that's you, then you might be the problem, because who is it that you're attracting? You're attracting the kind of person that you are. You are a person that attracts a certain kind of person. And so if you don't like who you're attracting, it might mean that you need to change. That's a really, I think, helpful question for us as we're processing whether you're single or married. But I also would challenge you with this. What's the Bible have to say about finding someone? And first, we said this is not a subject just for single people, right? Some of you may need to look to your wife and pursue her. Some of you may need to begin choosing to be with your husband. Like, that may be the choice that you need to make to focus on. But if we want relationships to be right in our lives, it starts with being right with Jesus. So what does the Bible have to say about looking for someone? Well, Paul said it this way in Acts. He said, look for a person who's after God's own heart, a person after God's own heart. If you're already married and you don't like who you're married to, then I'd ask, how much time are you spending being the kind of person you want to attract in your marriage? How much time have you spent becoming more like Jesus, being a person after God's heart? If we want to find the right person, we've got to do the right things. We've got to be the right person. 1 Corinthians 7 teaches that marriage and singleness are both acceptable for God. One is not better than the other, but Christians are supposed to marry other Christians. And so we're going to talk about that in a minute. But here's the second question, kind of the big arching question we're going to talk about today. And it's this one. And this one is a really hard one. So if you want to find out who you're supposed to marry, how do you know when it's the one? You need to identify who it is you want to be with, those kind of qualities or compatibilities. And then you need to make sure that you're the person who attracts those sorts of things, whether you're single or married. But here's the second thing. When do I know it's okay to call it quits? And I assume that the person is asking this within the context of marriage. How long, when I'm the only one trying, do I have to keep trying? When is it that I'm allowed to quit? Can I follow Jesus and still get a divorce? Or what about this toxic marriage that I'm in? How long do I have to stay in it? And the reality is that right now, we did this survey during the crisis that we're living through, right? And right now, across the world, as restrictions are lifting, you know what's taking place right after restrictions are lifting? Divorce rates are spiking. And so if your marriage is maybe not in great shape, it's normal. It's not okay, but it's normal right now, okay? Everyone is challenged with something they've never faced, with anxiety and stress they've never experienced, and it's difficult. So when is it time to call it quits? Well, I would say not right now, not while we're experiencing a once-in-a-lifetime sort of crisis. Endure it, push through it, and fight through it. And we're going to talk about what the Bible says about that. God does give us kind of a permission slip for divorce under certain circumstances, but it's not ever what God intended. Let me be clear. God intended marriage to be a permanent, exclusive union between a man and a woman, and divorce is never commanded. It's not even encouraged. In fact, Malachi says God doesn't like divorce at all. Some translation would say he hates divorce, but he does permit divorce. And so I want you to look here. He says he permits it on the grounds of sexual immorality and unwillingness to reconcile, and when married to an unbeliever who deserts the believing partner. And so there's a couple of pieces around this. But let me give you a question to reverse how we're looking at it. Instead of asking, how long can I keep going? How long should I keep going when it's hard or toxic or whatever? Maybe the question might be, instead of his blank grounds for divorce, is whatever it is that's horrible to you that's happening, instead of asking if that's grounds for divorce, maybe we should ask, is it grounds for forgiveness? Let's change the conversation. Let's talk about forgiveness instead of abandonment or divorce or pain. God doesn't hate divorcees. He doesn't hate people who've been divorced. He hates divorce because he knows how painful it will be. And so the Bible talks about two categories for divorce. It talks about sexual immorality and it talks about abandonment, especially when somebody's married to an unbeliever. Look here in Matthew It says, a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. In Matthew 19, it continues later on in the book. He says, I tell you, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery, unless his wife has been unfaithful. And so if adultery is an issue, if it's the issue that's causing you to ask the question, divorce is definitely permissible. It's not encouraged and it's not commanded, but it's permissible. And some of the greatest redemption stories I know of people even in this church are redemption stories that came from a relationship that was redeemed after an adulterous experience. I mean, it can be amazing. Jesus makes it clear that there is permission for divorce, but it was given because of human sinfulness, because of brokenness, not because it was God's ideal. So the other side of this is when you don't believe the same thing. And we're going to talk more about that, but 1 Corinthians 7 tells us that if you're a Christian married to an unbeliever, then it's really not a great idea. In fact, Paul says you shouldn't leave and you shouldn't get a divorce for that reason, because they could come to faith as a result of it. It could be an opportunity for you to serve them into eternity. If they leave you, it's one thing, but for you to leave them, Paul into the church at Corinth says, I don't think so. That's not a good idea, and it's not one of the ideas, or not one of the things on the permission slip for divorce that he offers. So maybe you're thinking about physical or emotional abuse. You haven't said anything about that, Kenny, and you're right, because the scripture is silent on those subjects. You should never stay in a home where you feel like your life is threatened. You should never be in an environment where you feel completely unsafe. Like, that's not okay, right? So while I don't think that the Bible teaches, well, I know the Bible doesn't teach it's okay to get a divorce because of physical or emotional abuse, I think it's consistent with the teachings of the Bible to walk through a period of separation. If things don't get better, continue seeking God along the way. One of the leading scholars on the Bible and divorce, he wrote this. He said, Jesus didn't naively assume that everyone in the kingdom would be perfect. Christians are called to suffer in marriage. Sometimes marriage is suffering, right? It's great happiness, but sometimes it's hard. He says, but they're also given a solution if necessary, an out if that's what's needed. So how long do you hang on? Let me give you the short answer. It's probably longer than you're expecting to. It's probably longer than you want to. But it's long enough that God can accomplish his purpose in your life through that relationship and allow you to continue pushing forward in something that's not completely comfortable. Remember, Jesus didn't promise happiness, and he's not all that interested at times in our happiness. He's more interested in our obedience than he is our happiness. He wants you to be happy, but he wants you to be obedient. And I believe if we'll be obedient, we'll be happier in the long run. Let's look at the third question. What if I'm in a relationship with someone who doesn't believe in the same thing? Some people may have framed it this way. They refuse to go to church, or do I have to choose between my spouse and my faith? Well, first of all, let's talk about people who aren't married. If you are not married and you're dating a person who is not a follower of Jesus, the scripture is clear. That's not a great idea. In fact, 2 Corinthians says it this way. It says, don't team up with those who are unbelievers. Don't do it. It's not a good idea. He says, how can righteousness be a partner with wickedness? How can light live with darkness? What harmony can there be between those with Christ and the devil? How can a believer be a partner with an unbeliever? He says, don't do it. You're not desperate enough to disobey God and date someone who isn't a follower of Jesus. In fact, Paul says it this way. He says in 2 Corinthians, don't be unequally yoked, one translation of the scripture uses. And he's talking in his era, in agricultural society, about a yoke between two oxen. And neither of those are oxen, but he's talking about the yoke between two oxen. This is a great illustration because the strength of these two animals is different. And they're going to pull in different directions. And when you pull in different directions, then you lose the efficiency of going together in the same direction. And marriage should be something that pushes us further in the same direction faster. And that doesn't take place when they're pulling in different directions. And so the yoke is what forces them to go the same direction. But if they're just pulling apart, it doesn't work. And so God says, don't be unequally yoked. Whether you're 14 or 45, looking for your first husband or your first boyfriend, or looking for someone you can live with for the rest of your natural life and be married to the rest of your natural life, don't do it. Don't walk down that path. I'm telling you, it might seem good in the short term, but in the long run, it's going to create tension and it's going to be really hard. And frankly, Paul says, don't do it. So the second piece is for Christians, and maybe you're already married to somebody who doesn't agree with what you believe, and maybe they're not a follower of Jesus. Well, he goes on to say in that same passage, he says that if you're an unbelieving spouse and your unbelieving spouse wants to stay with you, you should stay with them. That's not a grounds for walking away from somebody, but it doesn't make it any easier. It's hard. And so I would challenge you to love them in a way that makes you live out Jesus to them, that forces you to show them who Jesus is in your life and who Jesus can be in their life. If you're dating a non-believer and you're unequally yoked, to use our illustration, you shouldn't be in that relationship. If you're married to an unbeliever and you become a Christian during your marriage, you shouldn't leave that person. Your goal should be to love them to Jesus. It might take years. I can tell you there's people I pray for every day for their salvation. I'm 35 years old. I've been praying for them for over a decade now. And I'll continue to pray for them. Sometimes it takes a while. But I believe in the end, God will honor those prayers if we'll be faithful to him. Let me cover our last question today, or the last kind of set. And this one, man, was really challenging. And several questions around how do I handle a stressed relationship? Some of the words that were used were toxic people. How do I love somebody that I don't like? How do I be nice when another person is being ugly? How do I trust somebody I don't find trustworthy? How do I limit my anger? How do I deal with toxic people? And so let's start there. How do I deal with toxic people? Well, 1 Corinthians tells us that bad company corrupts good character. And Paul writes elsewhere, he says, Timothy rather. Yeah, well, Paul wrote it to Timothy. He says, as the end approaches, people are going to be self-absorbed. They're going to be money hungry, self-promoting, stuck up, profane, contemptuous of their parents, crude, coarse, dog-eat-dog, unbending, slanderers, impulsively wild, savage, cynical, treacherous, ruthless, bloated windbags, addicted to lust, and allergic to God. They'll make a show of religion, but behind the scene, they're animals. Stay clear of these people. Stay clear of these people. That's Paul's advice. Stay clear of these people. Now, that may not be possible for you, right? But if you can, it should be limiting our interaction with people that are those sorts of people that we just read about. But if we're around those sorts of people, maybe it's your boss, maybe it's your spouse, maybe you have a kid or a grown child, right? Then it's about limiting our interaction and being guarded when we are around them, because that's immensely important. And then what we're going to do is we're going to represent Jesus to them. Because the reality is, whether or not they're a follower of Christ, more than likely they're not if you're categorizing them as a toxic person and they fill in that category of all those things we just read out of 1 Timothy, right? But whether or not they're a follower of Christ, they're not living like him. And you have an opportunity to live like Jesus and impact and influence their life. It might change their eternity. It might change their life forever. You could be the person that influences them in a way that makes them not toxic to the next person they interact with, the next person they work with. You have that power. You have that influence. Remember, we talked about Easter just a couple of weeks ago. The same power that rose Jesus from the dead is the power that lives inside of you as a follower of Jesus. You have the power to keep your marriage together. You have the power to influence your coworker. You have the power to be a person who deals with the people that come into our lives that are toxic and encourage them to move away from toxicity. You have that power because Jesus is alive today. So what if we tried to teach them who Jesus is by living our lives like he would? The second part of that question about stressed relationships is, how do I remove anger in my relationship? How do I deal with that? Psalm 4 says, don't sin by letting anger control you. Think about it overnight and remain silent. Paul writes in the New Testament, he says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. When I was a kid, I remember my sister, she's about 7 years older than I am, and I was little, and I was a kid that grew up going to Sunday school. I didn't know anything about Jesus, but I knew a lot about the Bible, and those are not the same thing. And so she looked at me one day, and she was angry, she was mad, she was yelling at me. And I told her, I looked at her and I said, you can't let the sun go down in your anger. She said, well, that means I have until tonight. I said, well, the world's round, the sun's always going down, so you shouldn't be able to be angry at all for any length of time. And that's kind of an extreme example, right? But what Paul is writing about, what David is writing about, is that we want anger not to control us. It's not okay for anger to control us. And if we can't remove anger, if we can't let go of anger, it's controlling us. And when it's controlling us, it's never going to be removed. We're not going to be able to get something out of our life unless we choose to let it go. And that's a conscious choice, and it's a hard choice, and it's not one that's easy. And I find myself fighting the battle of letting it go every day. I find myself, I could be really angry about this offense. I could be really angry at this person. And sometimes that means I've got to unfriend or unfollow on social media so that I can purge my mind and allow myself not to be angry. Sometimes it means I drive a different route because something sparks that anger in me. Sometimes it means I stop walking by somebody's office for a day or two to get over what it is and let it go. And then I don't carry it forward, because when you do, it impacts you way more than it'll ever impact them. Don't carry that anger forward. The reason that it's wrong isn't because God just wants to keep you in a box and make sure you do his thing. It's because it's going to ruin your life if you let that anger hang on. So how do you remove it? You choose to value your relationship with Jesus and your long-term physical and emotional and spiritual health over just being angry at somebody who may or may not ever even know about it. And that includes your spouse. If you're hanging on to something in that relationship, or your kids, let it go. Just let it go. The third part of this question is, how do I love when I don't like? And this one is really, really challenging. Remember, you make the choice to continue to love and trust God for the like. That's the short of it. Remember, in relationships, we're going to be the kind of person who attracts the kind of person we want to be around, or the kind of person we want to be married to. We're going to be the person who attracts the kind of person that we're going to be around or we want to be married to. So when I don't love someone, or when I don't like someone, but I have to love them, or I want to love them, those don't have to be the same, right? We can figure that out, because love is a choice. First John, and John, this is kind of in reverse order. John is the same author of both of these, but he writes First John as an old man, and he writes John much earlier in his life. And as an old man, he writes the word, God is love. Identifies who God is and wraps it up into 4 words. God is love. But he says, you didn't choose me. I chose you. He's writing the words of Jesus earlier in his life that he had heard walking around with Jesus. And Jesus looked at him and says, you didn't choose me. I chose you. So the God of the universe, who is love, chose you. Love is a choice. So you can choose to love the person you don't like, and pray that the like will follow. You know, most of these questions are around action. And what action will I take? How do I decide what to do in this relationship? How do I decide how long to hang on? How do I know if this is the right thing to do going forward? How do I know if this is the right person to be with? And I found this really helpful in trying to make that decision, trying to take that action. And so I thought I'd share it with you. And I learned it from a pastor that I've been learning from a long time named Craig Groschel. And he made this statement, and I kind of live by it. And he says, if you're around the wrong people, listening to the wrong voices, living for the wrong values, then what seems right will often seem wrong. When we're trying to answer these questions, we're trying to figure out what's next. When we're trying to figure out how long do I hang on? Is this the right person? How do I deal with the stress in my life? How do I deal with this toxic person? Then I would evaluate, am I around the wrong people, the wrong voices, and the wrong values? Or am I around the right people, the right voices, and the right values? Because very quickly, I can find myself stuck and convinced of what's right, that's wrong, because I've filled myself with wrong. So if you can't figure out what that decision's supposed to be, I want to encourage you, be around the right people. Look for the right voices and live for the right values. And then what seems right will be right. And so there's a lot of different ways to go and take all of this and apply it and live it out. And I hope that you will. I want to encourage you. One of the things we put together for this week, for many of you who are dealing with marriage issues or maybe marriage tensions that are on the rise, you know, we are really excited to be able to give a free resource to our church. And for anybody you know, I mean, we're happy for other people to use it too, pass it along. But a free resource for our church that's a digital date night. And so what that means for us, or what that means for you, is that the hosts of our online services this weekend are dropping links in the boxes below. And what that link will do is give you the ability to register to get the content. And it's, like I said, completely free. It costs you your email address, I think. Maybe not even that. But what you're going to do is take that. And inside of there, it's going to give you options to restore relationships. And maybe you need to do a digital date night with a friend, right, to restore a relationship. Maybe you need to do it with your spouse, right? Maybe you need to do it with your kids, whatever it is, right? And so there's some conversation points. Maybe you're like me and you've got 3 kids, 5 and under, and you're like, digital date night. Date nights in my house during quarantine without a babysitter only takes place at like 11:30 at night and for like a half an hour before the baby wakes up, right? But this gives you opportunities and things for your kids to do. It gives you stuff for you guys to cook, and it gives you a 40-minute comedy special like you're sitting in a show in one of our auditoriums across the Permian Basin where you can reconnect and have a common experience. I want to encourage you, take advantage of that, look into that, join us on Wednesdays, and I hope to see you later this week.